Hey, this is Dr. Syed Haider with Michelle Harvey, and we're back for another basically lifestyle medicine show. And I think lifestyle medicine, the reason I love doing these so much is because I think lifestyle medicine doesn't get the credit it really deserves. It's far more powerful and far safer than really any other form of medicine, even supplements, right? So a lot of people shy away from Western medicine, like prescription drugs, and then they try to replace it with very powerful prescription medicine or non-prescription medicine, whether over the counter or just herbal products. Like you take curcumin out of turmeric and you concentrate it, or resveratrol, and those are very active biological compounds, and so they have similar kind of drawbacks as prescription drugs, where you don't know, they're being taken out of their natural context, and they may have knock-on effects that are unpredictable. And even though the whole biohacking movement, right? Like, I tend to view that with a little bit of skepticism, because it's very similar to just modern Western medicine in general. In that there's this like hubris, right? That we can understand what we need to tinker with inside our bodies. And it seems outrageous if you, like, for people who really know how complex we are, and the interaction between our own biology and then our microbiome's biology. And there's bacteria, there's viruses, there's fungi, there's parasites. There's all kinds of things, and we're really more of like a superorganism, than just an organism, right? So we're kind of like, it's just incredibly complex. So just the biochemistry of human beings, right? Like, sure, we've mapped out that, but what about the biochemistry of every single organism that's contributing to our physiology in our microbiome? And even if we mapped out all of those, thousands or millions of different species, what about the interactions between them, right? So it's something that, short of having like a quantum computer, you can't map out properly how all of these things interact. And one thing I was saying recently to my brother when we were talking about this was that like there's certain medications and supplements where enough people take them, you can see a signal of a side effect, and the side effect it basically means that a lot of people have the same side effect, right? But really, anything you do to yourself will have, especially like these like unnatural or like artificially like extracted compounds. There will be some side effects, right, beyond the effect that you're looking for, but they may be different in everyone, right? So they may interact with your physiology differently and produce a different side effect. And if the side effect is varied, if they're varied enough, it's difficult to find that signal in the noise, right? So like everyone has a slightly different side effect. Maybe the side effect takes 20 years to show up, right? Like, how are you going to find that signal? It's very difficult. So anyway, I do tend to think that natural substances, especially in their whole food form, are far safer, right? Like if you're talking about food, like turmeric, the spice, versus curcumin, which has been extracted from it, I think that's far safer than, first of all, curcumin, which is, I would say, probably safer than most pharmaceutical drugs, right? But still, there can be issues if you take them long term at very high doses, just as you have issues with taking aspirin or ibuprofen very long term at high doses. So anyway, I get off on these tangents. So anyway, that's basically the intro to why we're doing a functional medicine, or like a lifestyle medicine show. And Michelle, I know you had like a presentation and a topic for today, which I actually didn't know about before. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so it relates to what you're talking about, and it's related to fasting for women specifically, and also kind of like women's health in the scientific literature, which I know is kind of underrepresented for different reasons that we'll talk about. So I'm going to share my screen. If that's fine. So can you see?
Yeah.
Okay, let me see. Okay, I have to go this. So intermittent fasting is something that we recommend in the long COVID protocol and um, probably in some of our up and coming protocols also because it has great, lots of different great benefits that we kind of talk about. But I think that there is a caveat when it comes to women and fasting. And it's actually quite interesting to have a look at some of the scientific research that's been done and the differences between men and women in the mice studies and also in the human studies, because I think that anecdotally, a lot of women actually report some of these symptoms that you see appearing in the studies. So first of all, just in this is an intro, and it just shows the difference between the number of peer-reviewed articles on men versus women. It's 71 for men and 13 for women when it comes to intermittent fasting. And just to give people a bit of background on why this is, so in 1977, there was kind of a ban on women participating in clinical research mostly due to this thalidomide incident, which if people don't know about, it was basically a drug that caused birth defects, and they didn't know about it until it was too late. So after that point, there was kind of this ban on using women who were in their childbearing years, and the idea was kind of to reduce the risk, of the women and their baby and their children. So the intent was good, but as a result, for 20 years around almost 20 years until 1993, when this guideline was updated, that basically women were excluded from many clinical trials, which is definitely an issue. And as a result, I think even in medical school textbooks and a lot of the kind of guidelines for really common and, let's say, basic things like heart attacks are actually geared towards identifying those symptoms in men rather than women. So actually, wait, I'll skip to this first. So yeah, 50% of women are more likely than men to get wrong diagnosis for a heart attack. And this is because their symptoms are slightly different. So things like, I think, nausea, exhaustion, shortness of breath. There's not so much of the chest pressure and the tingling and the other more kind of common heart attack symptoms. And people attribute it to kind of this difference in diagnostic understanding.
So one other thing I just wanted to mention was that intermittent fasting, like all the stuff that we talk about with long haul, I mean, it really applies to both vaccine injuries and long COVID. It's not just COVID or long COVID. There's always a mix. There's some people who have kind of a mix of syndromes, and it's basically like spike protein injuries or spike protein toxicities, whether from a natural infection or from getting a shot or from both. And so what else did I just want to mention? But yeah, like you said, in 1993, the guidelines were updated, allowing women, but still they don't really take part in a whole lot of research, right? It's not that common. And they did not take part in the Pfizer trials, the Moderna trials, the other COVID shot trials. And yet they decided to roll them out to those groups without actually studying them in women who were pregnant.
Yeah, and I think that now, at least it's kind of mainstreamly accepted that the vaccines do actually affect the menstrual cycle, although at first women were kind of saying this and being called conspiracy theorists, and, there was a lot of pushback against saying that this was happening and that it was just anecdotal and all of these things. But I think now it's pretty accepted that they do cause some kind of disruption to the cycle.
I just also want to just point out that, like, it's more concerning to roll this shot or any medical intervention out to like a group of people that it hasn't been studied in, right? So like, even if you think that it's questionable to study it in that group, it's far more questionable to roll it out to that group and recommend it for that, and even mandate it sometimes for that group without studying it, right?
Yeah.
Like, then
yeah, I know this is
happening. And that's unfortunately the situation with a lot of medicine, where you don't study it in that group, but then it's just kind of like, okay, we'll do it off label, right? We'll do it anyway. We'll because you have to do something, right? And you don't know which one might be the best intervention. You just choose what you think is the best. So it reminds me of this, like what's the difference between off-label and like an experiment, right? Like an experimental drug trial. It's just, it's kind of like a difference in methodology, obviously. And like, are you tracking the outcomes, right? And so one of the medical board complaints was accusing me of experimenting on my patients. And, if you're running an experiment, you have to have an ethics board and you have to have some advisors and you have to, run it by them and make sure that like the study design makes sense and it's powered properly and you're going to get good results. And you don't need any of that with off-label prescribing. You're not running a trial. You're not tracking the outcomes. You're having more, less objective data, right? It's more anecdotal data, right? You're like, just in your memory, you're like, yeah, it seems that this works, right? And oftentimes that leads you in the right direction, but sometimes it can lead you astray, especially if you're talking about population level health, where it's like tiny differences that you can't really see at the individual level. And especially for things like vaccines, where you're trying to, give a medical intervention to an entire population in order to prevent disease in a small percentage of them, a tiny percentage of the time. So like childhood vaccines, some of these diseases barely exist anymore, right? You'll have an outbreak here or there of measles or chickenpox. But if you were that physician and the outbreak happened in your practice, right, you would think like, this doesn't work at all, right? Like, oh, my patients got the shot and they all got sick. This thing is useless. And if you're one of the physicians, just in a different city who never has an outbreak, you might be thinking, this works great. We never have measles and chickenpox ever. So anyway, I just think that I just wanted to point that out, that rolling this out and other things out to these populations without testing them is more ethically questionable than testing them first.
So
yeah, the vaccine, these shots, the COVID shots, definitely affect the menstrual cycle, and this is actually one of the most common things that people think is being caused by shedding. So women are the ones who most commonly come, and actually, I can only think of women who have come to me and told me that they think they're being affected by quote unquote shedding, which we know does happen. So shedding is happening, probably in minute quantities. Ryan Cole thinks it's being mediated. This menstrual cycle disruption is being mediated by pheromonal receptors that the spike protein may be, interacting with. So it is an issue, and it does seem to wear off pretty quickly. Like, it doesn't last. So, and it seems to mostly, like, again, this is anecdotal data, but this is all we have. It seems that it's most prevalent, like within a few weeks or a couple of months of the person having gotten a shot or a booster, that they can affect the woman who it seems, tends to be sensitive to this. But yeah, definitely the shot is far worse in terms of affecting the menstrual cycle, and also fetal development and, loss of, pregnancies and early births, and, everything that could go wrong in a pregnancy is going wrong at a higher rate. It also affects the structure even of the placenta. The vascularization of the placenta is affected, to the point that there's at least one ultrasound tech I've heard of that can tell you when you got vaccinated and with which vaccine you got vaccinated.
Wow.
And, when they're doing the ultrasound, the pregnancy ultrasound. So,
wow. Yeah, so I think, can you still see my screen?
No, we have to share it again.
Okay.
Bring it back up.
Okay, it's saying stop. Let's try again.
Oh.
Yeah, when I'm sharing the screen, I can't see you, so...
We can see your screen again.
Okay, great. So autoimmune disease, women make up 75%, and it takes an average of 5 years to be diagnosed. And this is, of course, for all different reasons. I think this is almost a whole topic in itself. which is interesting. But there is so much related to this, and there are a lot of people. So on this next slide, I talk about this lady called Alyssa Vitti, who has this brand called Flow Living, and Lara Brydon, and also Dr. Jolene Brighton. They all kind of write about the subject, but in particular, Alyssa Vitti talks about this idea that women have this monthly cycle that's not necessarily so compatible with the daily or weekly structures that we kind of tend to stick to in our work life and in our school life. And, right from a young age, we're kind of in a certain weekly cycle that's not so compatible with our internal cycle. And all of these kind of things sort of set you up for going against your biological needs and then creating basically disease later on. So I think this is one reason for that, but of course it's quite complex.
I just want to jump in here. This is interesting because I just read a couple of short articles by someone on Twitter who really writes a lot about testosterone. And so his theory is that we're becoming kind of like a low testosterone civilization over time. Like our testosterone levels are plummeting in men. And so he kind of draws a parallel between, so women tend to have more active immune systems than men. And it's because, I guess, like evolutionarily, they are, responsible for procreating and so if you have a more active immune system, you will tend to develop autoimmune disease more often than if you don't. So an autoimmune disease is just the immune system kind of turning back and attacking its own self, so attacking your own body. So this, autoimmune disease is more likely with lower testosterone. And so he draws like an analogy between autoimmune disease in a body and autoimmune disease in a civilization that has low testosterone, so he thinks that this is part of why we are, as a society, kind of like attacking a lot of our institutions that have served us well for generations. Anyway, I found that an interesting theory. I didn't really go down the rabbit hole of understanding in detail, all the ramifications and, of it and all the logic behind it. But I just thought that was an interesting idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's interesting to see, I think the sperm count also is going down every single year, and to the point where that in, I don't know, 50 years it will be almost zero because of all of the different things that affect all the stresses on the body and xenoestrogens and all of these different things. So yeah, this is interesting. And to kind of bring it out to a more macro level is also always an interesting kind of rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, one of the things that I didn't really look into, and I would like to later, is I think there was a connection made between sunspot and just solar output activity and civilizational trends, and apparently, I guess, testosterone perhaps as well. Like we're always, a lot of research is being done on like why do we have lower testosterone, right? Is it there are compounds in the environment that are, being industrial compounds that have feminizing characteristics, estrogenic compounds, and phytoestrogens, xenoestrogens that we're exposed to, a lot of soy, right? And other things. But if there's a link to solar energy, I'm not aware of it. But maybe.
So basically onto the studies about intermittent fasting. So intermittent fasting specifically for women, because the studies on mice and rats, and then I'll go on to humans, but they're quite interesting, I think, to look at, to see the difference between male and female. So this is a study about intermittent fasting. It's actually alternate day fasting, which is a bit different to intermittent. There are so many different ones. There's just calorie restricting the window, the alternate day, the multiple day fast. There's a lot of different ones, but this one specifically was alternate day. So for male rats, the change in hippocampus size, hippocampal gene expression, and ambulatory behavior was the same no matter what kind of restricted diet they were on. But for female rats, the degree of change and behavior was directly proportional to the caloric intake. So basically, this means that the female rats were uniquely sensitive to a starvation response in proportion to the calories that they were given, and that wasn't the case for male rats. So this is quite long, but I don't think I'll read it all. But it's this idea that the female rats become hyper-masculinized. Basically, they stop ovulating and menstruating. They become hyper alert. They have good memory and cognitive function and a lot of energy. But then this comes at the cost of basically infertility and a shrinking of the ovaries. And this isn't what happens with the male rats. They actually upregulate reproductivity in response to this metabolic stress, and female reproductivity downregulates. So the idea behind this is that when scarcity in the environment is perceived, the men need to reproduce more quickly and more prolifically, so they become more fertile, and because as a response to the women becoming less fertile, essentially, and the female rats become hyper alert, better memory, energetic, and all of these kind of things, because their bodies are essentially telling them to get food and to find food and really prioritize that rather than resting or sleeping. And I think it's interesting because anecdotally, this is something that I think a lot of women report when they do fasting, definitely in excess. This idea of, and this is almost something that's actually celebrated in the fasting sphere, this idea of memory and hyper alertness and cognitive function and all of these things, which is great, but it's important to also make sure that that's not being counteracted elsewhere. So this is another finding. So weight of the adrenal gland was similar. However, calorie restricted and intermittent fasting diets caused a relative increase in adrenal size, the magnitude of which was greater in females. So basically, they were experiencing more adrenal stress. So testicular weight was unaffected, but the ovaries would decrease in size. This was related to menstrual cycles. So the more calorie restricted, so in the 20%, there was increase in irregular cycles, but in the 40% calorie restriction, they basically lost the menstrual cycle altogether. And this wasn't the case for the male rats. And then this also relates to basically adrenal stress that was present in the females, but not in the males. So all of these things kind of relate to anecdotally what's reported when people do when women specifically do excessive fasting. And I think that in the studies on humans, there are some similar findings. This one is related to diabetes and glucose sensitivity. So after 3 weeks of doing alternate day fasting, women had an increase in the area under the glucose curve, which basically was an unfavorable effect on glucose tolerance, and an apparent lack of effect on insulin sensitivity. So, and that was not the case with men. The men actually benefited from this alternate day fasting in terms of glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity. But the thing that's interesting with the studies of fasting is that on women and men in humans is that when people are obese, they actually, the effect is different. And there seems to be much more of a positive effect doing fasting if you are obese, whereas if women are not obese, just normal and in the reproductive years, that's when they start experiencing these more negative side effects. This is one on Ramadan. So this was specifically done on, because there are quite a lot, as we spoke about before, there's a lot of studies done on the Greek Orthodox fasting and the Ramadan fasting. So changes in heart rate and blood pressure, there's a significant lowering of resting heart rate in men, and no changes were noted in regards to resting heart rate of women. So there's so much, if you actually read through the studies, there's just a lot of information about the differences. And I think that at least when fasting became super popular around 10 years ago, this wasn't really talked about. It was just all of these really positive benefits were celebrated, and this wasn't discussed. And because of this kind of confusion with the hyper alertness and the cognitive function and all of these things which do become upregulated, I guess people took that to mean that, oh, it's just overall positive. And then it was only later on with these kind of, so these are the symptoms to look out for to see if fasting is not working for you, perhaps. And it's things like insomnia, loss of menstrual cycle is the biggest one, and just hyper alertness to the point that, which might seem good, but not good when you try to go to sleep and you can't fall asleep. So that's when you know that it's just gone, it's extreme, and it's kind of gone to the point where it's no longer beneficial. So basically, I just listed some ways in which women can fast more safely. And I think one thing is this idea of fasting just overnight, which surprisingly a lot of people don't do if they go to bed super late. But if they eat dinner quite late, but just having a 12-hour overnight fast is a really good way to kind of just start fasting, and then maybe stretching it to 14 or 16 hours. And then also tailoring it to the menstrual cycle. There's always times, and I think they do this even in Ramadan, right? You don't do fasting over the menstrual time. So it's paying attention to that cycle as well as just whatever your fasting cycle is. And then this idea that we've spoken about before, which is the idea of fasting and even autophagy and all of these positive benefits and being in ketosis that we report are basically, as in some sense, they are a stress response. So in order to build up kind of resiliency and tolerance to the stress and get benefits of the positive stress of fasting, sometimes you need to just make sure that other stress is taken into account and under control. So for example, if you are sleep deprived, if you are, exercising too much, have gut health issues, emotional stress, are eating, low quality food, all of these kind of things put stresses on the body. And then the extra stress of fasting can then become negative. Whereas if you're managing all of those things really, really well, and everything's kind of a very stable base to start extending a fasting window, it might work, but you really have to kind of listen to your body. And I think that when people do fasting, they tend to get into this kind of rigid mindset where they, it's like, oh, this is my fasting window, and oh, I do alternate day fasting, or I calorie restrict, or I do all of these things, and that structure and framing around it can already be the opposite of intuitive, because you've just set that structure, and then you cannot notice when your body's actually suffering, and it actually more calls for this thing of, oh, I didn't sleep, I only had 5 hours of sleep, so I'm not going to fast today, or this kind of constant tweaking. So yeah, that's important to bear in mind. And then the last thing, this is not so much related to fasting, but I really like these kind of infographics that show different foods that you can focus on at different times, and they're for different reasons. So for example, follicular phase, high fiber foods with more fiber will help you detoxify estrogen, because generally estrogen is quite high at the beginning of the cycle. Obviously during menstrual phase you need more B12 and more omega-3s because they're anti-inflammatory, and every phase has calls for slightly different foods, and I think you can kind of support the cycle through focusing on these, which is interesting. And I think that is it for the presentation. That was awesome. I said a lot of things.
It's really interesting, like men don't have the same like monthly cycle, right? And so like women, some of the things that women do maybe need to be in sync with a monthly cycle. So I found that really interesting that maybe, while you're menstruating, you don't fast, you just eat
Mm.
normally. And then, and that, some people have found that beneficial. Like you don't have to fast like every single day, right? There's different ways of doing fasting. And so some people will choose a few days a month to fast, or they'll choose a couple of days a week to fast, or they'll just fast for like 5 days and then they'll stop fasting. And all of these have their own kind of benefits, the intermittent fasting, and some of them fit easier into people's, I guess, day-to-day, routines, and they're more psychologically easy to do. Like some people find, like myself, that if you do something every day, it's just psychologically more, easier to maintain it than if you do something like 3 days a month, every month.
Mm.
That's, it's harder. Like, so in one tradition, it's like fast for the 3 days of the full moon, right? And it's like, kind of hard to remember, like, okay, when is the full moon coming? And just to like, to
Mm.
decide to do that so intermittently is a little bit harder than saying, okay, I'm just going to eat within a 12-hour window every day. And the other thing I was thinking was that, eating within a 12-hour window is probably just kind of like normalizing your food intake, whereas like just constantly grazing is kind of abnormal for human beings. So yeah. Yeah. So maybe we can go back to that slide where you were talking about the, not eating during menstruation. Was there more to that?
Not eating.
Like while you're
Um,
actually menstruating, or like, no, avoiding fasting while you're actually menstruating.
I don't think there was no, there wasn't a slide specifically about, oh, when I was talking about the, yeah, that was just about how to optimize your, um, basically, I mean, Elissa Vitti, she's one of the people I recommended. She has a whole book about this, and it's basically how to optimize your life around your cycle. And it's even to the level of, oh, if you are doing a pitch for a new job or an interview, try to schedule it during the ovulatory phase. If you're doing, some high intensity training, so schedule it for this. If, try to clear out your schedule on the just before the menstrual phase and on the menstrual phase. And it's, you can just be really aware that your body's working on that cycle, and then tailor everything around it, from, from work things to how you eat, as I was saying, with different foods to support it, to how you do exercise, to just your relationships, just everything. So I think this is quite interesting, and also something that I think a lot of people are not aware of, because we grew up in this system of the weekly cycle, right? It's like 5 days and then the weekend, and then maybe holidays like Christmas or whatever it is, and we're not so in tune with this cycle.
Yeah. Um, yeah. The other thing, what else did I want to focus on? Yeah. So like the negatives of fasting, because I think, like you said, people focus on the positives of fasting a lot without realizing that there might be negatives. And the biggest negative is probably the insomnia, right? If you have trouble sleeping, you're
Mm.
really not benefiting anymore. You gotta dial in your sleep. Like that's number one for your health. You have to have rock solid, really great sleep and enough of it. And if you don't, you have to do whatever it takes to get
Yeah.
it, even if that includes eating more. And so the other thing is just like being aware of how you respond to things, instead of just believing something is good and just forcing yourself to do it, which seems to be kind of the avenue that a lot of us take, is just like, this is an unqualified good and I must do it every day. And
Mm.
and then you don't even like make the connection to how it's affecting you, and
Mm.
you just double down on it. Like, it's good, it's good. I need more of it, right? If it's
Yeah.
not working anymore. So I think that's important. And the thing that I think now is most important for people who are trying to change their health is just keeping track of how you feel. So, writing down maybe your top symptoms, the negative symptoms that you have that you're trying to get rid of, and then grading them on a scale of 1 to 10. And doing that at least once a week, if not every day. It's really not that hard. Just to give them a score on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is like barely there, and 10 is like extremely severe. So for most people, you'll fall somewhere in the middle. And if you're on the right track, symptoms should disappear over time. And if you're not tracking it, you won't even remember. that some symptoms have gone away. And then the other thing that you track is like when you make a change. So write down the date when you start doing something, when you start eating differently or taking a different supplement, or you stop a supplement. And if there's very few people I've seen, like probably like 0.1% of the population, that like to do this and that just do it naturally. But I think it's really important just for yourself. You'll rarely find a doctor who like looks at that, record and takes it into account, but you yourself can understand how you react to things from it and start to make connections to what works for you and what doesn't work for you and how it makes you feel. And other things, aside from just symptoms that I would consider tracking would be just quality of life markers, right? Like what's your mood like, what's your energy level like, and try to optimize for those things. And so you may not be suffering from low mood or, lack of energy, but you might be able to improve from where you're at, and focus, and all those sorts of things as well. And I guess the other thing, the other wrinkle here is that some women might want to stop menstruating. They might want to be more alert, and maybe there's like a middle ground where you can get some of the benefits without having this terrible insomnia. And so like individually, you might be able to find that middle ground, and part of that might be doing it on a monthly cycle, right? Where you don't fast, or you don't, especially while you're menstruating, and then maybe you make up for it later and have fasting at other times. And part of it might just be accepting what it means to be a woman, right? Like that you are a cyclical creature, right? That things will change during the month, and not trying to subvert that, not trying to just accepting that you might have different moods and different levels of energy and focus. And I mean, I'm not a woman, so I shouldn't be lecturing women to accept their womanhood. But I think that is, people in general should try to accept who they are, right? Like biologically and just emotionally. And, if you have, and this also like reminds me that like it's not just women, right, who may have like this cyclical nature. All of us have kind of like a life cycle, right? Like there's a period of youth, and then a period of maturation, and then you're kind of like mature, and then there's a period of decline. And this is like the natural cycle of life, right? And trying to avoid the like aging, I think, is probably happening too soon for a lot of people. So like this whole anti-aging thing, like I think that's very important, like in the sense that people are oftentimes, they have accelerated aging. And so you probably want to like peak a little bit later in life, instead of like in your 30s or 40s, maybe in your 50s, and then have like a kind of like a longer span of health. But there are some things that are just a natural part of decline that do happen, right? And trying to like completely avoid those is also unnatural. So I just put that in there.
Yeah, and I think the thing with the thing that maybe makes this fasting thing confusing is that when we talk about symptom tracking, a lot of people, well, women might say, oh, I have this hyper alertness and clarity and all of these things, so that's positive. But then when that comes hand in hand with, let's say, like loss of menstrual cycle, then that's actually negative. So what things that could seem positive at the beginning later on can be negative. And this happens with a lot of other things. Like this happens with keto. When people go keto, right, they feel really great, but then after a while, maybe their microbiome suffers because they're not having micronutrients or fiber. And or for example, I'm trying to think what's another, had something else in mind. Going vegan. When people go vegan, because they by default eat loads of fruit and vegetables, which they weren't eating before, and they feel really great. But then after a while, you start having these nutrient deficiencies and lack of bioavailability and phytates and anti-nutrients and all of these things that cause gut irritation. So yeah, unfortunately, it's not as simple as just kind of like, oh, I feel good in the first week or so of doing this, therefore I'm just going to stick to this forever. You kind of do need to pay attention to longer term effects. And when I mean, if you miss, for example, if you skip a cycle, the hormones that regulate the menstrual cycle have many other functions also. They're not just doing that, they're doing so many different things. And I think like I can't remember if it's I think it's progesterone has something like 80 different functions. um so if you are you know, if you're you've put kind of a spanner in the works of your hormonal cycle, it's not just having an effect on your fertility. And because a lot of people think, oh, it doesn't matter, I don't need to get a period because I'm not trying to have a baby now, so who cares? You know, it's not that, because every single other thing that those hormones are supposed to be doing, they're not doing anymore. And then that's going to have a long-term effect on your health. So this is why it's important to pay attention, even if you're not trying to conceive or anything like that. So
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's good or bad to, naturally stop the cycle. I mean, I did share with you that book, which comes from
mm,
classical Chinese medicine, where this author suggests that, it might be like a kind of like a life extension practice, or like conserving your energy practice, to naturally stop the menstrual cycle. And so like the method that he recommends is not fasting, but
mm,
this like what's called the deer exercise, and it's detailed in the book. Stephen Chang, he wrote a couple of books. So one place to find it is Stephen Chang's Internal Exercises, and another one is The Tao of Sexology. Sounds silly, but
mm,
um, yeah. So kind of like a Kama Sutra from a Chinese medical perspective. But yeah, so he recommends actually a similar practice for men, where like classical in the classical Chinese thought, they would not like limit their ejaculations, right? So he kind of like draws a similarity between monthly ovulation and ejaculation in terms of losing kind of like a vital energy force in men and women. So the Taoists would recommend only ejaculating if you wanted to impregnate a woman, and otherwise doing what they called injaculating, where you kind of like squeeze the muscles down there, do like a Kegel at the moment of ejaculation, and it actually prevents ejaculation, kind of like recycles the sperm inside. That's not that easy, not that easy to do. But another way of achieving the same thing is you kind of like press this point on or near the prostate to prevent ejaculation at the moment of ejaculation. And so you kind of like get there, but it doesn't come out. So you kind of like store it up inside. So I don't know. I do tend to, you know, I don't know about believe, but tend to give more credence to these ancient medical systems. But even when you look into classical Chinese medicine, it's interesting that their kind of like source of knowledge has been corrupted also, right? Like it's not like, what is it? The Yellow Emperor's classic of internal medicine. So that's kind of their source book of knowledge for classical Chinese medicine. And we only have like the remnants of it. We don't have,
mm,
the original, if you want to call it that. So there was a period of like the Warring States period, where a lot of knowledge was just lost. And now we have like fragments of it, and you kind of have to try to put it back together. So it's kind
mm,
of like this ancient, thriving civilization, and we just have like the ruins of it left. And so you kind of have to like interpret what's there.
mm.
And so there's a lot of different interpretations of what is, healthy and not healthy. But I just wanted to put in there that the Taoist interpretation of this would suggest that, I mean, they would recommend that men ejaculate less and women, menstruate less, unless you're trying to have a baby, right? So you build yourself up, and eat the right foods and everything, and get ready for a pregnancy. It might take a year or two. You want to like be in an optimal state of health and nutrition. And so they have recommendations for how to do that for women and for men. And then you try to have the baby. And then once you have the baby, then obviously you're not menstruating for 9 months. And then after that, there's going to be an inhibition of menstruation during breastfeeding. And actually the deer exercise for women kind of works along the same lines, is that the way that menstruation is inhibited during breastfeeding. And it's basically like by stimulating the breast that apparently you can stop menstruation naturally.
Mm. Yeah, I think this is, well, Laura Briden talks about this in her book. I haven't read it in a while, but I think one of the reasons why people say going on the pill is healthy is because you can stop having so many menstrual cycles, and there are benefits associated with that. But for my understanding of it, although of course, like, all of the downsides of going on the pill does not mitigate that at all, but that this is just something
Mhm.
that some
Yeah.
gynecologists say. But um, I think the idea is that we were never really designed to have this many menstrual cycles because people were pregnant a lot earlier and younger and had a lot more babies, like 10, 11 children, and, died earlier. So we just weren't really designed to have that many cycles. Whereas now it's like people in there, well, who just never have kids or um, live really long, or yeah, it's not really, we're not designed for that. So it does make sense to some level. And yeah, I had a look at what you sent, which looks interesting. I didn't actually know there was kind of ancient tradition rooted in this idea, but it does make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess the life force is thought to be in that tradition is thought to be like rooted in the kidney area, and it's related to sexual health. And so their aim is to lengthen lifespan and health span with these practices, the Taoist practices, things like qigong and internal qigong as well as external qigong exercises. All right, so we have some questions. Hopefully, we can answer them. So the first one is from Laura. She says, "Hi, just coming in now. Are you talking about pregnant women today? If so, quick question. My niece is 23 and due in May. In 2021, she had COVID and got one shot. No effects that we know of right now, but just for preventative measures, is there a safe amount in higher doses of vitamin C and D that she can take while pregnant just to help knock down any spike proteins she may still have floating around?" With the understanding this is not medical advice. And so, yeah, I don't know. That's the essential issue, that we don't really do studies in pregnant women, so we don't actually know. I would just say that vitamin D is a hormone. It's not just like a nutrient that you need. So it has hormonal effects and wide ranging effects, and so it can have a powerful impact on obviously your immune system and your entire physiology as well. And so yeah, I think the question is just we don't really know the answer. So I tend to, like, with pregnancy, my approach is I don't know if this is right or wrong, but just like, you're talking about two people there, right? And it's very sensitive, right? Like, you definitely don't want to mess it up, right? I mean, it's terrible when that happens, when you when you lose a pregnancy, right? Like, it's a terrible outcome. And so I think, rightly so, many people are very conservative with pregnant women. And if you really talk to the pregnant women themselves, they will also want to be usually very conservative. And so you kind of have to test their temperature sometimes as well, and let them know that, hey, we don't know, and these are the possible benefits. These, the risks may be just unknown. We don't know. Your physiology is different when you're pregnant. So things that might seem to make sense for somebody who's not pregnant, or might work in one way for somebody who's not pregnant, might work in a different way for somebody who is. And it just might affect the baby and the pregnancy. And so, maybe try for things that are more natural, right? Like just getting a lot of sun, and eating a lot of fresh food that's high in vitamin
Mm.
C. So,
Yeah, I haven't a good article relating to the subject. I just found it, and I'm gonna post it here in the chat. Um, yeah, there's a good article about vitamin D. I mean, the fat soluble vitamins are always more risky to overdose on because they are stored in the liver and adipose tissue, and they're not as easily excreted. Um,
mhm.
so yeah, I think it is definitely one to watch out for. But yeah, I think Julia has shared the link about how the body responds to excessive vitamin D, and this is a good article.
Pete mentions that on the subject of low testosterone, it could be in part that we're less active, less manual labor, and could go up again if more people exercise. So yeah, exercise affects testosterone. Competition affects testosterone. So really competitive, you know, industries, and tend to have men with higher testosterone. And so but the competition, it's not just that it attracts people with higher testosterone, but the competition itself leads to higher testosterone. So, men being in competitive environments will raise their testosterone. So if you don't have any competition in your life, you should go get some if you're a man, and it can have a big effect. Sunshine, I did briefly look it up. I think it does also affect testosterone levels by increasing dopamine levels. So there's a lot of different ways to naturally increase testosterone. So a lot of our lifestyle has affected our testosterone, but I think it's also the chemicals in our environment that may be impacting some people. Chris says, can no testosterone keep me from losing weight? Yes. Yeah. So higher testosterone does help you lose weight. I've been working out 5 days a week and eating healthy, but the scale won't budge. I started DHEA. How long will it take to be on it before I get this testosterone up? Do you think there could be other reasons I can't lose weight? Since having long COVID, I've gained 11 pounds. Yeah, so this is a great question. It's really important for a lot of people. I mean, I gained weight with long COVID too. Some people gain weight. I haven't really seen a whole lot of people who do. A lot of people lose weight, and then some people, there's no change at all. And so what leads to weight gain? This is an interesting question. So I'd like to hear from Michelle, but, certainly there are probably obesogenic chemicals in the environment. With long COVID, the spike protein and the inflammation itself oftentimes affects hormone levels, which can affect weight. Like you said, testosterone, higher cortisol levels are there with long COVID, which stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, which initially that leads to higher adrenaline. And then in the longer term, when the sympathetic nervous system continues to be stimulated, it raises cortisol. So cortisol is a steroid. If you take exogenous steroids, you will gain weight, like, prednisone. So cortisol kind of has a similar effect of making you gain weight when it's around over the long term. And then changes in gut health, in gut bacteria can also change our weight. And so we do know that there are decreases in bifidobacteria infantis with long COVID. And what else? Stress, lack of sleep. A lot of people with long COVID have poor sleep and their body's under a lot of stress. And so that kind of ties into the cortisol and the adrenaline as well. And what else? I mean, obviously, I guess what you eat has something to do with it. But with people who are like just, I was doing everything the same and now I'm just like 20 pounds heavier. I didn't change anything. I'm eating the same. It's obviously not the food; it's the hormonal milieu inside your body. What do you think, Michelle?
Yeah, I think that you covered most of the things. I guess when people say I've been eating healthy and working out, this is kind of, what does that mean necessarily? If, for example, someone's doing an hour of cardio, they're sitting at their desk all day and then doing an hour of cardio, that can actually make you gain weight because it's, going to make you extremely hungry. You're not in a fat burning heart zone rate. It's something like weightlifting is really great. Sprinting, of course, not in the case of having long COVID because we want to keep stress and the heart rate down, but generally for weight loss, things like heavy lifting and sprinting are much more, and going for really long walks and trying to be active more in the day than sitting is more effective than doing kind of cardio workouts. And then, yeah, also eating healthy, it depends, are you more on the low carb or are you more on, having 7 servings of grains a day, something, it's just what your spectrum is for what healthy is and keeping sugars down. I think it's important to kind of just make sure that you're focusing on whole foods and having a protein-rich breakfast and hitting protein targets. These are kind of the key things for weight loss.
Yeah. I also want to mention, I found a lot of benefit in cryotherapy for long COVID, and that does increase brown fat levels, which have a higher metabolic rate. And so brown fat is the kind of fat that you want, and it's usually around the shoulder area. And it helps to burn the white fat, which you'll find in, the kind of fat that you don't want in your hips and in your belly and everywhere else that makes you look fat and feel fat. So cold exposure, intermittent cold exposure can help as well. And so, yeah, I mean, losing weight is it's kind of like a whole lifestyle, right? And sometimes you just got to be patient with it. And the intermittent fasting can be a part of the plan for some people, as well as just changing some of the diet in some people, and focusing on nutrition over calories, right? Like there's a overload of calories in our diets and not enough micronutrients in them. And
Mm.
that kind of leads to this, people being obese and not having, and still malnourished, unfortunately,
Yeah.
because they have the micronutrients that they need, that their bodies need. And that also stimulates the appetite, right? It's like, I don't have what I need, so keep eating until I get it.
Mm.
And the stuff that we're eating is just completely empty of the nutrition that we need oftentimes. Um, so going for like really high quality, food, and organ meats, I think, is one method of really packing your diet with nutrition, and something that people used to really focus on and eat a lot of, and now a lot of people don't eat it at all. Scott says, how does fast, and sorry, we didn't answer like how long it'll take for the DHEA to get the testosterone up. Yeah, I don't know the answer. I don't really I don't prescribe hormones usually, Scott, but I would assume not very long, maybe within weeks or months. Scott says, how does fasting affect chronic migraines? Oh, the other thing I just want to mention, yeah, so maybe for this question, Scott says, how does fasting affect chronic migraines? Eating seems to help reduce the number of migraines, specifically protein. I'm worried that fasting will impact migraines. Any thoughts? Yeah, so yeah, I've had migraines in the past, and they kind of bled into like a medication overuse headache syndrome as well, and sometimes I would get tension headaches too. But definitely have a lot of experience with migraines. So some people, fasting is a migraine trigger, and so I would recommend easing into it, not like doing it all of a sudden, and you just got to see like how it interacts with your own physiology. And maybe if you do it, gradually and slow and gradual, then your body will be able to adjust. And so migraines, like any chronic kind of condition, they're very multifactorial. And for some people, they may be linked to histamine intolerance. And for other people, it just might be a lot of different things, a lot of just, you can oftentimes get rid of them, but you might have to approach it like holistically and just improve your general health and diet, and maybe find food triggers and other things that are contributory, but not like, there may not be one sole cause. There usually isn't like one single thing that you can address that gets rid of them. It's usually a pronged approach that's required to improve history of migraines. What do you think, Michelle? Do you have any experience with migraines?
Yeah, I mean, so again, I think Lara Briden, she speaks a lot about hormonal migraines, although, I mean, this person who asked this question is a man, I think, so that maybe that's not relevant for him. But I think, it's sometimes a lot of people get cyclical migraines according to hormones. But I think that, yeah, it's always like, for example, I know someone who always gets a migraine after they have wine with sulfates in it, or if they have MSG, then this can really trigger migraines. And I think it's this kind of thing that we always talk about, where if your whole life has to revolve around avoiding triggers, it means that you have underlying health conditions, because you should be able to have a glass of wine once in a while, or a meal at a Chinese restaurant, and be fine, and not be in bed for the next 2 days. And that means that your body's just very much on the edge of not handling whatever stresses and imbalances are going on. And then one thing comes in, and it's just the straw that broke the camel's back. And to live in that state is not very pleasant. And it's also just quite stressful. And, it means that you have to address it from this multifaceted angle.
Yeah, absolutely. Laura asks, if I'm adding no calorie electrolyte powder to my water, am I breaking my fast? I would say no. It's the calories that break the fast. What about coffee? Does that break our fast if adding a little sugar? So I guess, you can fast from a lot of different things, right? You could fast from coffee, although, drinking coffee with no sugar and no cream and essentially 0 calories wouldn't break like a caloric fast. So you got to kind of define your terms, what you're trying to do. So what we're talking about here, generally speaking, is fasting from calories.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know like what the technical cutoff is, where you leave a fasted state. And I think there's some disagreement on this. So like 15 calories, does that break your fast? No. you know, 5, 15, 60, I don't know, like where's the cutoff? Do you have any idea, Michelle?
I think it also depends on what it is, because if you have, for example, if you have coffee and cream, that's different to coffee and sugar. Because, you know, often when, if we're already in ketosis because we've been fasting, and then we have something high fat, that won't necessarily kick you out of ketosis. But if you have something with loads of sugar, like a sugary coffee, then definitely that will, because it will spike your insulin, and your insulin will be needed to process whatever that is. So yeah, it just depends what it is and how long you've been fasting for. And yeah, and I think it's quite debated at what point, you know, something will break the fast, and at what point you will actually be in a true fasted state, in terms of being in ketosis or autophagy or these type of benefits that we talk about. But when, you know, when we talked about this idea of fasting for 12 hours, it's not even necessarily to get into ketosis or to have autophagy, but it's just to give your digestive system a rest, because we're not supposed to be constantly digesting all the time, and just to give your body your digestion a chance to rest and reset, and, you know, have some insulin sensitivity again, and just restart the next day. So it's not only about these kind of main benefits that are highlighted, but there's a lot of different things that are positive when it comes to fasting.
Yeah, I would also just caution people from replacing the sugar, like the caloric sweeteners, with non-caloric sweeteners, because they also do affect our physiology. So even if there's no calories, you are affecting your body when you take something in that tastes sweet. And, you know, coffee, obviously you're getting caffeine, but you may be affecting, you know, your microbiome as well by drinking the coffee, and there may be other effects from the taste of it that that has
Mm-hmm.
on physiology. So, I mean, if you have to, you know, you can't get by without the coffee. Just have the coffee, but have it black with no sugar, no cream, if you want to remain fasted. And you'll find yourself drinking far less when it's not sweet and
Yeah.
cream. You know, you might just be like, okay, a few, you know, sips and that's good. I'm good, you know, instead of drinking the entire cup. So, but yeah, I mean, watch out for caffeine headaches. That's a real thing that can be, you know, it can take a few days to get past if you quit caffeine completely. Um, Even longer in some people, and it can also trigger headaches. Or sorry, that's what I'm talking about. It definitely triggers headaches. So
Mm-hmm.
let's see. I think those are all the questions we have related to fasting. There are some other questions that we got that we're going to try to answer on Wednesday during my live stream Q&A that might be more related to medical issues. Any kind of closing remarks here, Michelle?
Um, no, I think that's it. I think, yeah, I think I've said everything I need to say about fasting in women, but definitely check out those references of, because I really love, especially Laura Brydon. She has an amazing book called The Period Repair Manual. And it's really amazing because it's like she talks about every possible issue and then goes through supplements and diet interventions. And it's just very precise and quite prescriptive, and it's like, try this and then try this and then try this, and if it just doesn't work, then go to this, and it's quite amazing and useful. So yeah, I would
Awesome.
recommend that.
Cool. All right,
Great.
everyone. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe wherever you're watching this, and if you're on Twitter, retweet it. And again, yeah, thanks. And we try to do this every Thursday. Sometimes we miss a week, but hopefully we'll be here next week.
Yeah.
Michelle.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Thanks a lot,